The question is whether or not count 8, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, has been charged before in Colorado. I checked on that this morning. I thought you might have that question. And in fact, I believe it's been charged 6 or 7 times. I don't know that first-degree termination of a pregnancy has been charged, but I believe it's been charged a handful of times since the statute passed.
Can you tell us what Michelle or her family had to say after you informed them of the charges being filed?
I don't want to go into specifics of the question is whether I can talk about what Michelle and her family had to say. Let me simply say this. Michelle is a wonderful person, and her family is incredibly supportive. They're wonderful people. They have been, I've met with them several times. They understand the legal process and are focused on her recovery and her healing. And they really appreciate the enormous outpouring of support from across the state of Colorado, across the country, in fact, across the world for them. Michelle is doing very well, but she understands. We've been talking about the legal process since I first met her. She's a very intelligent, very compassionate, very smart person. She understands the law.
Was she disappointed?
I don't want to put words in her mouth.
Mr. Garnett, can you do the math for us, please, in basic terms? How many years, if convicted, would this woman spend?
Well, you know, the question is how many years would she serve if convicted, which seems like a simple question. Seems like something I ought to be able to just give you an answer to. As with many questions in the law, it's not so simple. There's a couple things you got to look at. The first is the way that Colorado sentencing works in terms of ranges, and then the issue of whether or not sentences would be consecutive or concurrent. Now, we charge these cases the way we did because we think it fits what the facts of the case are. Individual, separate injuries, and if the defendant is convicted of all of them, particularly with the enhancers, I anticipate that Ms. Weigel and I would ask for a very substantial prison sentence. It could well be consecutive. It could well be upwards of 100 years if it all was put together that way. But it depends on many, many things, how the case plays out, how the judge sees the case. And our position in the case will, of course, always be formed after consultation with Michelle and her family.
And a follow-up, sir. You named the unborn baby Aurora.
Mm-hmm.
Was the family's, did they pick that name prior to this incident, or did they pick this name after what had happened?
You know, I don't know the timing. I asked them what the baby's name was, and they told me her name is Aurora. Yes?
Lawmakers are again wanting to introduce a fetal homicide bill, and I'm assuming that's a result of this. Do you have any thoughts that you can share about that?
The question is whether I have any thoughts about the fetal homicide bill in the legislature. I don't know what's happened today. As you might know, I've had a few other things I've been working on. I was down at the legislature yesterday testifying on another bill. I'm down there quite a bit. The legislature is a complicated organism, if you will. Where they end up, I don't know. My job, though, and the people need to know it, I will enforce whatever laws the legislature passes. My personal views about the law are simply not relevant, especially when we're bringing charges as serious as these charges. Yes?
Was the determination of the time of death of the baby tied to the level of oxygen in the lungs? Is that how it's defined?
Yeah, there were some issues there. The question is determining time of death of the baby and whether that was tied to oxygen in the lungs. And the coroner is a better person to answer that. But let me say this. One of the first things they looked at was whether the lungs had ever been inflated, and they had not. Therefore, consistent with Aurora not taking a breath. Yes?
Attorney Garnett, can you clarify, is there nothing in Colorado law that will allow you to bring charges for the losses of the baby, even if the attacker set out specifically to kill that baby?
Well, I don't like...
And it died before it did not take a breath outside its mother?
The question is sort of a hypothetical question, which I don't like to take when I'm talking about a specific case, but let me answer it this way. The issues in Colorado law that are very clear, and as many of you know, I assume there's a few lawyers here, to prove a criminal case, you have to prove the elements of the case at each stage. One of the elements of a homicide case is that one prove that the victim was a person. A person is defined specifically as someone who had been born alive and was alive at the time of the homicidal act. So that's how that plays out. Whether you could hypothetically come up with a fact pattern that would meet that requirement, For a homicide charge, I don't know. This certainly is not it.
Okay, but all these charges, including this last one, are losses incurred by the mother, correct?
Well, they speak for themselves. The statute is what it is. Aurora is named in Count 8. Yeah, I don't know what else to tell you. The law is what it is. Yes?
Mr. Garnett, after this incident happened, Longmont Police said it was time to have a conversation about mental illness. Would you talk about that, and can you say anything about what you anticipate in terms of the defense in this instance?
The question is whether or not I want to comment on the Longmont Police discussion of mental illness and mental illness generally. I don't in connection with this case. The comments that were made by Chief Butler were very appropriate. They were talking about the general issue of taking care of the mentally ill in our community. What issues this defendant, whom I've never met, might decide to raise with her lawyers, I don't know. I can just tell you that Ms. Weigel and myself and my entire team will work very hard to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, including mental state.
Mr. Garnett, can you talk about how difficult this case is going to be for your office? I understand that everybody's a professional here and everybody's been doing this for a long time, but I would imagine that this case cannot not touch the core of what this community is all about. Many of the people work for you are parents.
Sure.
Talk about that.
Well, I'm a parent myself, and yeah, most of my employees are parents. The question is how it's going to affect us. Of course it will affect us, and it's a challenge, a case like this, but we deal with violent crime all the time. We're in the middle of our getting ready for our third homicide trial of the year. Many of you covered the Dino Martinez case back in January and February, very violent double homicide. We deal with these issues all the time. I have very skilled staff, they're very professional, and we have a strong mental health support system to help them and to help the crime victims. We're very focused on making sure the victims that we work with are well taken care of. Yes?
What changed in that initial testimony when the police report came out last Friday and the baby took a breath? That's a pretty specific statement. What happened? How did you arrive at the change?
Well, I didn't arrive at the change. It was simply an investigation done. And as you guys, I don't know if you've ever been involved in investigation of a complicated crime, but a lot of times the initial burst of information is a little bit chaotic because of the crime scene and things have just happened and people are running around. And then you go back and re-interview the witnesses and give them a chance to tell you in a leisurely fashion what happened and what they recall, then you line that up with the other evidence. So I don't know, I mean, one of the realities in a case like this, because it's so closely watched, is that people will pull bits and pieces of a case out of the police reports, et cetera. That certainly happened here. My job is to make sure we're very thorough, we go through everything, we'll look at all the evidence. That's what happened here.
Mr. Garnett, the Colorado House passed a single-sentence abortion-neutral fetal homicide bill recently, and it's been discussed that that may be reintroduced. So if it's abortion-neutral, would you support a fetal homicide bill that had no effect on abortion policy?
I'm not going to talk about my political views. This is a press conference to talk about serious criminal charges that I brought. You know, I'm not a shy guy. If people want to find out about my political views, I'll show up and talk about it from time to time, but not when we're talking about charging somebody with crimes like this. Any other quick questions?
With the sentence enhancer, is there any chance of life in prison, or is this the maximum is 48 years?
Well, Ms. Lane, I believe, is 34 years old, perhaps 33. There's not life in prison as there would be with life in prison, but she could get a very long sentence and very well could die in prison, depending, again, on many things that have to process on the case.
Are you taking a look at the handful of other similar, I believe there have been a handful of other similar cases like this around the country or the world?
Yeah, there are. That's a good question. I'm being asked whether I've looked at other cases. I'm on the board of directors of the National DA's Association. I've talked with a number of my colleagues around the country. We're looking at those cases. Many of them are very, very similar in terms of fact pattern, and they're all, of course, very difficult and tragic cases. One more question. Great. Thank you all very much.